On January 13th, 2015, 43-year-old Anna Moses was sitting in her office at the University of Texas at Dallas when she heard her cell phone ding inside of her purse. Anna knew she was not supposed to use her cell phone during work, but she had a feeling she'd just gotten a text from someone very special. So Anna kind of discreetly slid her phone out of her purse, and when she looked at the screen, she smiled. Like she'd thought, her boyfriend, Michael Stodnick, had texted her to confirm that they were still on for dinner that night. Just looking at this message gave Anna butterflies. Michael was a business professor at the university where Anna worked, and he was the first man she had seriously dated since her divorce about 2 years earlier. Anna and Michael had been an item now for the last 6 months, but for Anna, who'd previously been married for 15 years, dating still felt very new. She and Michael were both single parents in their early 40s, but this new relationship made Anna feel young again. Anna quickly texted Michael to let him know she was definitely still on for dinner, then she quietly slid her phone back into her purse and got back to work. Anna was the assistant director of strategic planning and analysis at UT Dallas, but that was not her only job. She was also a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in data analytics, so Anna was very busy. But as soon as the clock hit 2 p.m., Anna stood up from her desk and headed upstairs. She knocked on an office door before opening it, but really the knocking was just a formality. The person sitting at the desk inside, University Vice Provost John Workowski, always expected Anna for afternoon tea. When Anna walked in, the 71-year-old administrator greeted her with a smile and called her by a special nickname, Babochka. It meant butterfly in Russian, and hearing it made Anna feel nostalgic for the country where she grew up. Anna sat down across from Dr. Workowski, and right away he handed her a steaming cup of tea. Dr. Workowski had wild gray hair, big glasses, and he always smelled like cigarettes. Anna was not particularly fond of the smell in his office, but she still felt very comfortable with him because over the past 2 years, she'd spent hours in this office confiding to him about her personal life. Dr. Workowski knew things about Anna that most people simply didn't, like that she'd immigrated to the United States in 1998 just to marry her now ex-husband, Bob Moses. He and Anna had met in Russia when Bob was visiting as a tourist. Then they kept in touch through email for months until he finally asked her to marry him. Bob had been Anna's anchor in America, which made their divorce that much more painful for her. Anna and her ex, Bob, were still on very friendly terms, but at this point, Dr. Workowski had really taken over the role of being Anna's rock now. That day, Anna and Dr. Workowski's conversation centered around Anna's 20-year-old son, Igor, who was a student right there at UT Dallas. Anna said she was worried that she and her son might be growing apart. The previous weekend, Igor had driven the 15 miles from his dorm to her home in Frisco, Texas, as he usually did, but Igor had seemed quiet and distant all weekend. It made Anna worry that he had some problem that he didn't want to talk about. Dr. Workowski sipped his tea, then told Anna she was a great mother and not to worry. Sometimes children, especially adult children, just need some space. He assured her that whatever was going on with him, Igor would eventually tell her when he was ready. Anna sighed and said, you're probably right. Then she finished her tea, gave the doctor a hug, and headed back downstairs to her office. A couple hours later, at around 5 p.m., Anna turned off her computer and grabbed her purse. It was cold outside, in the 30s, so near freezing, so Anna put on her coat and 2 scarves before waving goodbye to her coworkers and walking outside to the parking garage. She got inside of her blue Hyundai sedan and then headed into rush hour traffic. Part of the way home, Anna's stomach began to growl. She was hungry. Anna looked at the clock and saw that it was 5:30, which meant her boyfriend Michael would not be picking her up for dinner for another 2 hours. So she decided to pull off the highway right then and go to a fast food restaurant, a Taco Bell that served Mexican food, and she went through the drive-thru and she bought a chicken quesadilla. Anna was really hungry, but after receiving the food, she didn't eat it in the car. Instead, she just set it on her passenger seat. Anna generally preferred to keep her surroundings really tidy, and so she never ate in her car. It was just too messy. About 15 minutes later, Anna turned into her neighborhood. As she approached her 2-story brick house, she stopped beside her mailbox and rolled the window down to grab her mail. Then she pulled her Hyundai into the garage. Anna shut the garage door behind her, she gathered up her purse, her mail, and her quesadilla, and she got out of the car. She walked towards the door that led into her home, thinking about how excited she was for her date that night with Michael. But as she reached for the doorknob, Anna heard the sound of rustling behind her, followed by a loud clap. Just after 7:30 p.m. on the same day, Michael pulled up to Anna's house, and he noticed all the lights were off, as if Anna was not home. Michael was confused, but he got out of his car and knocked on Anna's front door. When she didn't answer, he called her, but she didn't pick up. Michael thought about going inside. Anna had actually recently given him a house key, but he knew Anna always turned on her alarm system when she left the house, and he didn't know the code to disable it, and he didn't want to set it off and cause a scene in such a quiet neighborhood. Michael began to feel cold just standing outside, so he turned around, went back to his car, and tried calling Anna again. But Anna's phone again went to voicemail. Anna had never missed a date with Michael before, but Michael told himself, Anna was very busy, she was a grad student and a mother, she could have easily gotten sidetracked with any number of things. So even though he was very disappointed, Michael decided to go home and wait for Anna to call him back. He was sure she would explain everything as soon as she could. The next morning at 9 a.m., Michael once again pulled into Anna's driveway. He had continued calling and texting her until 11 p.m. the previous night, but she never responded. Michael even contacted Anna's friends to ask about her, but they too had not heard from her. And so when Michael woke up on this morning with no text or no calls from Anna, the first thing he did was drive to her house. Michael knocked on the front door, and when there was no response, instead of going in, he instead called the Frisco Police Department. He told the dispatcher that he hadn't heard from his girlfriend since the previous afternoon when she was working at UT Dallas, and now he was at her house knocking on her door and she wasn't answering phone calls or text messages, and so he asked if somebody could come out to her house to make sure she was okay. The dispatcher was obviously empathetic, but they told Michael that for this type of thing, protocol was he would need to call the university's campus police first, and then if for some reason they couldn't handle it, then they would ratchet this up to the Frisco Police Department. And so Michael hung up and then looked up the number for the university campus police and called them, and they promised him they would look into the situation right away. Michael thanked them and hung up, and even though he still felt very uneasy about this, he had to get to work. So he got into his car and drove away. Less than an hour later, Frisco Police Sergeant Jay Ream received a call from the University of Texas Dallas campus police. They told Sergeant Ream they were looking for a university employee named Anna Moses. Her boyfriend had just called to request a welfare check, and the campus police had quickly learned that Anna did not show up for work that day, which her coworkers said was highly unusual. Because Anna was not actually living on campus, the university officer asked Ream if he could go check her home in Frisco. Ream said he was on it, and a few minutes later he was out the door, headed towards Anna's address. Ream got there at 10:50 a.m. and knocked on the door. When nobody answered, Sergeant Ream tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Ream knew he could knock down Anna's door, but that seemed extreme. Instead, he called the campus police back and asked if they knew anyone who could let him inside. Over an hour later, at 12:05 p.m., two cars pulled up outside of Anna's house. A campus police officer stepped out of one, and Anna's son, Igor, got out of the other. The university police had been able to find Igor on campus, and he told them he had a key and knew the alarm code to his mother's house. Igor nodded curtly at Sergeant Ream, then unlocked his mother's front door and walked inside and disabled the alarm. As Ream entered Anna's home, Igor walked past him and back outside. He did not seem concerned at all about his mother. He just said he'd be out in the car waiting for whenever they were done. Sergeant Ream thought Igor's behavior was strange, but he couldn't worry about that right now. Instead, he and the university police officer walked into Anna's foyer. The house was totally silent except for the officer's footsteps on the tile. They searched the first floor, but they didn't find any sign of Anna, and they were about to head upstairs when the sergeant remembered they should scope out the garage. Ream made his way to the door that led to the garage, and he opened it. And right away, even in the darkness, he could tell Anna's car was not parked inside, making the garage feel very empty. Then he flipped on the overhead light, and he gasped. Anna was lying on her back on the garage floor with blood coming out of her mouth, and there were bullet casings all around her. It was obvious just from looking at her that she was deceased. The university officer came over and looked into the garage too, and instantly brought a hand up to his mouth in shock. Neither of the officers had ever seen anything like this before. Frisco was an extremely safe community with very few violent crimes. It actually had been called one of the safest cities in the entire United States. But that only made Anna's apparent murder that much more shocking. Her quiet suburban home was now a crime scene. Even though he rarely worked homicide cases, Sergeant Ream knew the protocol. First, he and the university officer backed out of the garage and closed the door so they would not disturb any evidence. Then they checked the rest of Anna's home to make sure nobody else was there. Once they confirmed the house was empty, Reem called the Frisco Police Department for assistance. Reem then slowly walked outside towards Igor's car parked by the curb. As he got closer, Igor rolled down the window and looked at the sergeant without saying anything. Once he reached the car, Reem took a deep breath and told Igor that he had terrible news. His mother was dead, and it looked like she'd been murdered. The sergeant watched Igor for a reaction, but the young man's face was blank. Then Igor just furrowed his eyebrows and asked if his mother was in one piece. Sergeant Reem was so surprised by this question that he just said, "Well, yeah." Igor nodded and then said he had to go because he had class. Reem had no idea what to make of Igor's very bizarre reaction. It was so odd, but Igor had just received this life-shattering news, and Reem knew, shock can make people behave in totally inexplicable ways. So for now, Reem decided to give Igor a pass, and he just figured, they would do everything they could to find out what happened to his mother. Then the sergeant heard a siren blaring, and he looked up to see a Frisco PD cruiser heading his way. A few minutes later, Frisco detective Brian Schutte and Texas Ranger Reuben Mankin stood inside of Anna's garage. The two men were from different agencies, but they'd both been assigned to lead the case together. The crime scene made Schutte feel totally sick. He was a very young detective, and this wasn't just the first time he'd be leading a murder investigation. This was his first murder case that he'd ever worked on. Detective Schutte squatted next to Anna's body. She was still wearing a heavy coat and 2 scarves, but he could see a bullet wound in her neck. And scattered on the floor around her were a few unopened envelopes, an empty Taco Bell wrapper, and a black purse. There were also a handful of bullet casings, which the detective identified as coming from a .22 caliber gun. Detective Schutte told Mankin that it seemed like Anna had been outside, which is why she was wearing warm clothes, and she had come in and was carrying her mail, purse, and fast food trash when somebody shot her in her garage. Schutte figured that Anna had likely been killed the previous evening when she came home from work. Ranger Mankin nodded in agreement, but he pointed out that Anna's car wasn't parked in the driveway or the garage, so he wondered if her killer had stolen it. Maybe Anna had been killed during a robbery. But then Detective Schutte opened up Anna's black purse, and it didn't seem like anybody had rifled through it. And Anna's wallet, which contained $300 in cash, was still inside her purse. And the inside of Anna's house also looked totally undisturbed. So if this was a robbery, the only thing the killer stole was Anna's car, which didn't really make any sense. Schutte told Mankin that he really wasn't sure about the robbery theory, it felt kind of weak, but the missing car did give them a good place to start. So Schutte radioed the Frisco Police Department and asked a fellow officer to put out a bulletin about Anna's stolen vehicle. But at the same time, Schutte was thinking to himself that it seemed most likely that Anna had been killed by somebody she knew. After all, the killer had clearly gained access to the garage without breaking in, and the young detective couldn't stop thinking about the very strange statements and behavior of Anna's son, which the local police had briefed him about. Schutte really wanted to interview Igor as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Detective Schutte sat down across from Igor inside of an interview room at the Frisco police station. Igor looked remarkably calm, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. The detective asked Igor to please talk about his relationship with his mother. Igor said that he and his mother had always been very close. They both loved music, and when Igor joined a Christian rock band as a teenager, his mom supported him and came to almost all of his shows. Even now that Igor was living on his own at college, he still went home to visit her every weekend. Anna kind of babied him by doing his laundry and cooking for him, but Igor kind of liked it. But he said seeing Anna divorce his dad had been really difficult. Bob actually was not Igor's biological father. He had adopted him. And so for Igor, he looked at Bob as his father. That was his dad. And when Igor said that, Schutte stopped him because he hadn't realized Bob was not his biological father. But Igor explained that his mother had actually been married twice, once briefly to a man in Russia and then to Bob in the United States. The Russian man was Igor's biological father, but Bob had legally adopted Igor when he was just 4 years old. And as Igor talked about his dad, Bob, he became emotional. Igor said he, personally, Igor, had been diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer when he was just 8 years old, and his dad had always been there to support him. Igor's cancer eventually went into remission, but the experience showed Igor that Bob genuinely loved him like he was his own son. Detective Schutte couldn't help but feel moved by Igor's story, but he wanted to stay focused on the horrible crime he was still investigating. So he asked Igor if there was anyone who would want to hurt his mother. Igor thought for a moment and then said no. But he added, whoever killed his mother should be forgiven. Igor said he was a devout Christian and he believed all people, even killers, should be treated with mercy. Schutte was shocked. Igor did not seem to care at all that his mother was horribly murdered, but the detective just stared at the college student trying to remain professional and followed up by asking Igor where he'd been the previous evening. Igor said he had been in class from around 5:30 p.m. to 9:45 p.m., and he had classmates who could vouch for him. Schutte did not have any evidence that would allow him to hold Igor any longer, though he still felt very suspicious of him. But despite Schutte's inexperience as a detective, he still knew the worst thing an investigator could do right now was get tunnel vision about one suspect. For now, he knew he needed to explore every possibility, and he knew exactly who he wanted to talk to next: Anna's ex-husband and Igor's dad, Bob. After Schutte told Igor he was free to go, the detective went to his office, and he saw Ranger Mankin had left him a note about the progress in his investigation, and that the medical examiner had sent a copy of Anna's autopsy report over. Mankin's note explained that he'd been able to reconstruct Anna's last day by obtaining security camera footage from UT Dallas, local toll roads, a Taco Bell, and also an elementary school near Anna's house. After reviewing this footage, Mankin estimated that Anna got home from work between 5:50 and 5:55 p.m. on January 13th, and based on the crime scene, he felt certain she was killed almost immediately when she went inside. Next, Schutte looked over the autopsy report that was sent over, which largely supported Mankin's theory about when Anna was killed. The medical examiner said Anna had been shot at close range 6 times. All of the bullets came from the same .22 caliber gun, and the wounds were grouped tightly together, which made the medical examiner think her killer had some level of experience using firearms. But there was one odd detail that really stood out to the medical examiner. The detectives had told him before he did the autopsy that Anna had bought a quesadilla at around 5:30 p.m., which would be less than half an hour before she was killed. And considering they found the empty wrapper for this quesadilla next to her dead body, it suggested she had eaten it. However, when the medical examiner examined Anna's stomach contents, it looked like she hadn't eaten for many hours prior to her death. And if Anna didn't eat that quesadilla, well, according to the medical examiner, it seemed highly plausible that her killer did. Schutte was so disturbed by the idea of somebody who could shoot someone in cold blood 6 times, kill them right in their house, and then pick up their Taco Bell and eat it over their body. It just seems so unbelievably psychotic. And so Schutte called Ranger Mankin and said he knew it was late, but they did not have time to waste. They really needed to dig in right now. So, shortly before midnight on Wednesday, January 14th, Schutte and Mankin knocked on the door of a medium-sized home in Frisco. This is where Bob had been living since his and Anna's divorce. He was renting a room and sharing the home with 3 other men. Bob answered the door. He was wearing pajamas and looked confused to see the police. He asked if everything was okay, and Detective Schutte just said no. They needed to speak with him about his ex-wife, but it would be better if they talked at the police station. But Bob didn't move right away. Instead, he stayed in his doorway and just kept asking, really, what's happening here? Can you tell me anything else? And finally, Detective Schutte said, I'm sorry, but unfortunately, your ex-wife is dead. As soon as he said it, Bob's face just fell, and he agreed to go with them to the station. Bob's interview began at 1 a.m., so it was now Thursday, January 15th. And it wasn't until Schutte, Mankin, and Bob were actually sitting in the interview room that they told Bob Anna was not just dead, she had been murdered. Bob looked horrified, and his first question was, is Igor okay? The police assured Bob that Igor was fine. Then Ranger Mankin asked Bob where he'd been on the evening of January 13th, the night that Anna was killed. Bob said he'd been home watching TV till about 7 p.m., and then he went out for dinner. And he said his 3 housemates could easily confirm his story. Bob admitted he owned 5 guns, 3 of which were .22 caliber, and he agreed to hand them all over to police for ballistics analysis. And when detectives asked him for a DNA sample, he gave them a swab without any hesitation. Ranger Mankin thanked Bob for his cooperation and told him he was free to go. After Bob was gone, both Mencken and Schutte agreed that Bob did seem honest and seemed genuinely distressed at his ex-wife's death, but they still needed to follow up on his alibi. However, it was super late, nearly 2 a.m., and so Schutte and Mencken decided to call it a day. But just then, Schutte's phone rang. A Frisco Police Department patrol officer told him that they had just found Anna's stolen car in a residential neighborhood a few blocks away from her house, and the patrol officer was pretty sure they could see blood inside. Schutte's heart started to race. He told the patrol officer to make sure nobody touched that car. In the meantime, he would arrange for a tow truck to bring the vehicle to the crime lab for analysis. After a few hours of sleep, Schutte arrived at the Frisco Police Department crime lab early on Thursday morning. Anna's blue Hyundai sedan was there, and a technician was waiting to brief the detective on what they'd found. The technician said the vehicle was remarkably clean inside, except for a few things. There was an empty Red Bull energy can, there was a cigarette butt, and there were 2 small blood stains, one on the right side of the driver's seat and one on the center console. Schutte was really excited at this news. And so he had the can, cigarette, and swabs of the blood sent off for DNA testing, along with the swab that Bob had given them during his interview. But Schutte knew it could take weeks to get these results back, so for now, he still had to continue with old-fashioned detective work. The most obvious person to interview next was Anna's boyfriend, Michael. He agreed to come in for an interview, and soon Schutte was sitting across from the business professor at the police station. Michael leaned forward and ran his hands through his short brown hair. He looked anxious. And before Schutte even began the interview, Michael asked if he should have a lawyer. The detective promised him this was all totally routine. Michael picked at his fingernails as he told Schutte that he and Anna had not been dating for very long, but their relationship had been moving in a good direction. He said a few days ago, on January 13th, he'd gone to Anna's house to pick her up just after 7:30, and he'd been confused by her absence. And now he was horrified to know Anna had been lying dead in her garage the entire time he was there. Once Michael began talking, he started to open up a bit more, but as soon as Schutte asked him for a DNA sample, he clammed up. Then he asked again about maybe getting a lawyer. The detective said that really wasn't necessary, but he would give Michael some time alone to decide whether he wanted to cooperate. Schutte left, but what Michael didn't know was that the detective could still see and hear Michael through a camera in the corner of the room. So Schutte watched as Michael began mumbling to himself. The detective could not make out all the words, but at one point, Michael asked himself, "Am I overreacting?" A few minutes later, the detectives went back in and asked Michael if he had made a decision. Michael said yes. He said he would give a sample of his DNA. Schutte smiled, and then he got the swab from Michael and told him he was free to go. Then Schutte sent this newest DNA sample to be tested against the other items from Anna's car. While they waited for the DNA results, Detective Schutte and Ranger Mencken interviewed some of Anna's friends and co-workers. And quickly, the investigators soon learned that Bob and Michael were not the only men in Anna's life. Anna's friends pointed detectives towards a man named Jerry Caspel, a poet who they said had a deep spiritual bond with Anna. Her co-workers also mentioned a vice provost at UT Dallas named Dr. John Workowski, who seemed to be Anna's mentor. Detective Schutte contacted Jerry first, and when he arrived for his interview, he was totally overwrought and on the brink of tears. He told the detective that Anna was his muse, and without her, he didn't know if he'd ever be able to write poetry again. Schutte narrowed his eyes at Jerry's very melodramatic display, but he let him keep talking. Jerry explained that he met Anna at a public speaking course a few years back, and they'd bonded over their love of art. They often went to the opera together, and Anna would read and edit Jerry's poems. He'd published 2 books of poetry and dedicated them both to her. Schutte thought this connection sounded very intense, so he asked Jerry what Anna's boyfriend thought about them being so close, and Jerry looked surprised. He said he didn't even know Anna had a boyfriend. But regardless, he insisted their relationship was not romantic, it was purely spiritual. The detective found the whole tale pretty hard to believe. He asked Jerry if he owned any firearms, and Jerry said yes, he had a .22 caliber handgun. But he quickly agreed to let the police analyze it, and he also gave them a DNA sample. Next, Schutte asked where Jerry was around 6 p.m. on January 13th. Jerry said he was driving home from work on a Dallas toll road that was very far away from Anna's home, and the toll records would certainly reflect that. Schutte thanked Jerry, and as soon as the poet left, Schutte just shook his head. It did not seem like Jerry was a viable suspect. So he called the next man on his list. A few days later, Detective Schutte began to interview Dr. John Warkowski. The university administrator explained that he met Anna through work, and they grew very close during her divorce. Then, Dr. Warkowski said something surprising. He told the detective that he and Anna once had an affair. Schutte stared at the man, who was 70 years old, making him 27 years older than Anna. Dr. Warkowski said he knew that he and Anna seemed like an unlikely pair, but it really was true. He said Anna wanted to have a relationship with him, and he had to cut it off because of their age difference. It just seemed totally inappropriate. But they still remained close friends, and so Dr. Warkowski knew very intimate details about her life, like how she struggled emotionally and financially after her divorce. Dr. Warkowski said he considered it his privilege to help Anna with money. In fact, in the 2 years since her divorce, he'd wired her a total of $46,000. Dr. Warkowski insisted this money was given as a gift with no strings attached, but Schutte was not convinced. He wondered if maybe, during one of their intimate conversations, Anna had learned something about the administrator that he wanted to keep hidden. What if those gifts were actually hush money payments? Or maybe he was paying Anna for sex, and she was threatening to expose him. Thinking about the items found in Anna's car, Schutte asked Dr. Warkowski if he drank energy drinks or smoked cigarettes. Dr. Warkowski said he didn't like energy drinks, but he definitely smoked. And when the detective asked for his whereabouts on the evening of January 13th, the administrator said the same thing Jerry did. He was driving home from work on a toll road that was far away from Anna's home, and certainly the records would reflect that. Schutte made a note of this, but unlike Jerry, he didn't think this let Dr. Warkowski off the hook. So Schutte asked the administrator if he'd be willing to give a voluntary DNA sample. Dr. Warkowski said he was happy to do anything that would help the police solve this case. So he let the detective swab the inside of his cheek before he left the police station. At this point, Detective Schutte felt like he had 5 strong suspects: Anna's son Igor, her ex-husband Bob, and her boyfriend Michael, plus the poet Jerry, and the university administrator Dr. John Warkowski. They all claimed to have alibis, however, none of them had been corroborated yet. Detective Schutte briefed Mencken on everything he discovered about these suspects, and Mencken agreed that they couldn't rule any of them out quite yet. Shortly after that, the detectives got disappointing news from the ballistics analysis on Bob and Jerry's guns. None of the guns matched the one that killed Anna, so they still didn't have the murder weapon. Schutte sighed. Until he got the DNA results and Mencken finished investigating their suspects' alibis, he had no other leads to pursue. But Detective Schutte didn't want to just sit around waiting for other investigators to do their work, so he started wondering if maybe he should go back to Anna's house and have another look around. Police had done an initial search, but there was always a chance something got missed. So Schutte obtained a search warrant, and in late January, about 2 weeks after Anna's murder, he returned to her home. When he got there, he saw there were 2 cars parked outside. So he went up to the door and knocked, and was surprised when Anna's ex-husband, Bob, answered the door. Igor was standing just a few feet behind him. It turned out the father and son had moved into Anna's home a couple weeks ago, 1 day after her body was found in the garage. This struck the detective as a very strange thing to do, but Bob quickly explained that he and his son were grieving together. And because Igor lived in a college dorm and Bob lived in a house with 3 other men, Anna's home was the only private place they could go to. Schutte said that did make sense. However, even though they wanted private time, he held up a search warrant and said he needed to come inside. So Bob immediately opened the door wide and said, "Come on in." The first thing Schutte did is he went into Anna's home office. There, he dug through her desk drawers until he found something that stopped him in his tracks. It was a copy of Anna's life insurance policy. Anna had taken out a policy worth $750,000, and she had named one person as the sole beneficiary, her son, Igor. Suddenly, it looked like Igor, whose behavior had struck investigators as very odd from the onset, stood to gain a lot from his mother's death. Then Schutte managed to jimmy open a locked drawer in her desk, and he found something even more interesting. It was a handwritten letter, mostly in Russian. He couldn't understand what it said because he didn't speak Russian, but he figured it must contain something very private since Anna had kept it in a locked drawer. Schutte quietly slid the letter into an envelope and then left the desk and finished searching the rest of the house. He didn't find anything else in the house of note, and so after he left and got back to the police station, he sent a copy of that letter to the FBI so an agent who spoke Russian could translate it for him. In early February, Detective Schutte received a translation of that letter from Anna's desk, and suddenly, Anna's murder started to make a lot more sense. Anna had written this letter herself about one of the police's suspects, and it cast her connection to this man into a totally new light. Next, Ranger Mankin reported back that he had checked out all 5 men's alibis, and he'd been able to verify all of their stories except for one of them. The person whose alibi could not be confirmed was also the same person Anna had written about in her letter. And finally, Schutte got the results of the DNA analysis. DNA from the Red Bull can and cigarette butt in Anna's car did not match any of the suspects, and it didn't match anybody in their criminal database. But those bloodstains found in Anna's car did match a suspect, the same one who did not have an alibi and who Anna wrote about. And so, based on this evidence, along with further investigation into this primary suspect, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Moses when she returned home from work on January 13th, 2015. Late that afternoon, Anna's killer crouched in a corner of her garage, clutching a .22 caliber rifle. He'd been able to slip inside a few minutes earlier because he knew the code to open the garage. Now he was waiting for Anna to get home. Just past 5:50 p.m., the killer heard the sound of the automatic garage door sliding open. Light began to fill the dark garage, and so as it did, he pressed his body back against the wall, trying to be as small and out of sight as possible. He watched as Anna pulled her car inside. The garage door shut, and the killer heard Anna's car door open and then close. Then he listened to her footsteps as she walked towards the door to her house. But before she could open it, the killer stood, raised his gun, and fired 3 shots into her back. Anna spun around in shock. She dropped her mail, purse, and the quesadilla she'd been carrying but not eating. Before she could say anything, the killer fired 3 more shots. 2 hit Anna in the chest, and the other hit her in the neck. Anna crumpled to the ground with blood flowing out of her mouth. Anna's killer slowly lowered his rifle and walked towards her. He watched her chest for any sign of movement, but it wasn't moving. She was not breathing. So he picked up her car keys off the floor and was about to get into her car when he saw the uneaten chicken quesadilla on the floor. So he picked it up, ate it right next to her body, and left the wrapper behind. The killer then got into Anna's car, opened up the garage door again, backed out, and shut the door as he drove away. But he didn't realize that he had a cut on his right hand, and it was leaking blood onto Anna's car seat and center console. The following evening, the killer abandoned the blue Hyundai in a neighborhood a few blocks away from Anna's home, and as law enforcement investigated Anna's murder, her killer did his best to appear very cooperative. He agreed to be interviewed, and he agreed to give a swab of his DNA. But at the same time the killer was kind of putting on this act, in the background, he was doing everything he could to profit off of Anna's death. And that's what police understood as soon as they read the translation of that Russian letter. It was a note that Anna had written to her lawyer in 2013 during her divorce from Bob, and she told her lawyer that Bob was now threatening to kill himself and frame Anna as his murderer just so her son, Igor, would hate her. When Detective Schutte read this, he realized Anna and Bob's divorce was not nearly as amicable as people thought. In fact, the couple had a long history of problems. In 2008, Anna visited a counselor after learning Bob had an affair. She wanted to leave him, but said she felt indebted to him because of how much he'd helped her during Igor's cancer battle. And years later, Anna had called one of her close friends crying, saying she had locked herself in a closet because she was afraid Bob was going to kill her. Anna hid these ugly realities about Bob from her son because she knew her son loved Bob. Bob was the only father figure Igor had ever known, and Anna didn't want to damage that relationship, even if it meant she had to act friendly towards a man she feared. But Bob was angry that Anna divorced him, and he was filled with jealousy over Anna's relationship with Michael. Adding to Bob's bitterness, Anna got total ownership of the large 2-story house they used to share. Bob claimed that at the time Anna was killed, he was at home watching TV, but his housemates told police they did not remember him being home at that time. And while none of Bob's guns matched the murder weapon, he was a military veteran with experience using guns. And so police believe Bob must have taken apart the murder weapon and hid or destroyed the pieces. And if police had any doubts that Bob was the killer, well, the DNA evidence totally erased those doubts. It was clearly Bob's blood inside of Anna's car, likely from a cut on Bob's right hand that he had bandaged by the time he met with police. On February 26, 2015, Detective Schutte and Ranger Mankin arrested Bob at Anna's home. Bob maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty at his trial. Bob's defense argued that there were too many unanswered questions in Anna's murder, like whose DNA was on the Red Bull can and the cigarette butt found in Anna's car. But the prosecution argued that Bob may have planted this evidence just to confuse investigators. In the end, a jury found Bob guilty of murder, and a judge sentenced him to life in prison. Bob would appeal his conviction in 2018, but an appeals court upheld the jury's original ruling, and to this day, Bob remains incarcerated. 28-year-old Patricia Kimball had to force herself to smile as she looked out at the laughing group of friends who filled her backyard. There was no question that the Saturday evening barbecue for her fellow Sunday school teachers and other members of the Elm Street Baptist Church had been a very big success. It was September 9th, 1995, and the early fall air had been warm without being hot, and the clouds passing now and then over the sun, along with the leafy trees that stood around the Kimball single-story greenhouse, offered just the right amount of evening shade. And not that long ago, this happy gathering would have represented everything that Patricia had ever wanted in life, and everything she had always loved about her small hometown of Pleasant Garden, North Carolina. There was her 26-year-old husband with his toothy smile, green eyes, and strong, sturdy build, and right next to him was Patricia's brother, Reuben, and his wife, Christy, and just off to Patricia's right, she could see her closest friends laughing and chatting as they began to gather up empty plates and leftovers and take them into the kitchen. And out of sight, but still within 30 miles of where Patricia was standing, there was the apartment complex where she worked as a manager, there was the building supply store that her husband owned, and there were the homes of her parents, her in-laws, and her cousins. But ever since Patricia's marriage 17 months earlier, the happiness that Patricia had expected to feel as she assembled these building blocks of a good life, husband, family, church, friends, and work, had slowly faded. And in its place was Patricia's growing sense that the future she had imagined when she walked down the aisle to exchange rings with the man she had loved ever since she first laid eyes on him might never materialize. Yes, she and Ted had their cozy 3-bedroom house on Brandon Station Court, and yes, they were both devout Christians who were active in their church, and yes, Patricia still hoped that she and Ted would start a family together. And yes, some of her anxieties, like the fact that the house she lived in had been robbed twice, had nothing to do with being married. Still, the break-ins had shattered the sense of security Patricia felt as she started her new life with Ted. Even though no one had been hurt, and the burglar who robbed them the second time had eventually been caught by police, now, no matter how hard Patricia tried to control her fear, she still felt her chest tighten every time she approached the house and saw an unfamiliar car in the driveway or parked out on the road. And maybe it was that feeling of always looking over her shoulder that had made every other event that had nibbled away at Patricia's dream of a safe and happy married life seem worse than it really was. But overall, it just felt to Patricia that the love and romance that brought her and Ted together 3 years ago had been totally replaced by practical daily routines. Instead of spending the weekend together camping in the mountains, she and Ted sat at the kitchen table and paid the bills, or cleaned the house, or mowed the lawn. And Patricia wouldn't have minded the feeling of settling into that kind of routine if she felt like she and Ted were still enjoying their time together. But lately, Patricia had begun to worry that after less than 2 years of marriage, she and Ted were already starting to grow apart. Maybe Ted was even having second thoughts about having married her. After all, Patricia knew that when she had first met Ted almost 5 years ago, back in 1990 at the church youth group, they had been just friends and definitely nothing more. And Patricia also knew that between 1991 and 1992, Ted had had a serious crush on Patricia's second cousin, the beautiful Janet Blakely. But by 1992, when Janet was getting ready to go off to college, Ted had suddenly seemed to notice Patricia in a different way. And it wasn't long before the slim, smart, dark-eyed woman with the knockout smile went from friend to sweetheart and then to wife, leaving Janet Blakely crying in the back of the church when the pastor had announced to the congregation that Ted and Patricia were engaged. At first, when Patricia tried to talk to Ted about their marriage, He had looked at her in surprise, then pulled her close and told her everything was good and she should stop worrying. But when Patricia brought the subject up again, Ted seemed irritated and impatient. And then, just 1 week before today's barbecue, Ted had told Patricia that he had just applied to work a 3 to 11 p.m. shift at a local textile company that manufactured all different kinds of fiber-based materials. Ted's announcement had taken Patricia completely by surprise. There was no question that the two of them had very different attitudes toward money. Patricia had always been a saver, while Ted was more of a spender. In fact, by the time Patricia was 16, she'd set enough money aside to buy her first car, used, and by the time she was 23, she had enough in the bank for a down payment on a house. Ted, on the other hand, loved all the extras that money could buy, outfitting his late-model Jeep Cherokee with all the options, and now he had his eye on a new motorcycle. For Ted, money and social status were very important. He and his younger brother, Ronnie Jr., had spent the early years of their childhood living in a small mobile home in a trailer park on the edge of Pleasant Garden. And Ted's father, an alcoholic, barely made enough money to keep the family afloat. All that had changed when Ron Sr. had given up drinking and taken his wife and 2 sons off to Liberty University in Virginia. After getting his degree in pastoral leadership, Ron Sr. had returned to North Carolina and settled his family in Julian, a few miles south of Pleasant Garden, where he was hired as the pastor of the Monnet Road Baptist Church. But even though the family's financial and social status had improved after Ted's father, Ron Sr., became a pastor, Ted still always was given a lot of responsibility. That included watching out for his younger brother, Ronnie Jr. He was very socially awkward and held back in school by a learning disability. Ronnie Jr. was just not nearly as quick and confident as his older brother was. Still, both boys had always worked hard. Ronnie mostly did odd jobs around the neighborhood until he joined the military and enlisted in the Marine Corps. Ted became such a good employee at the local home building store that when the business owner, Gary Lyle, retired, he sold Lyle's building supply at a very good price to Ted. But even though Patricia understood the reasons why her husband was ambitious and why he enjoyed owning luxuries his family had never been able to afford when he was young, there was just no way that Ted needed to get a second job, especially one that would leave Patricia, who was already spooked by the break-ins, alone at the house that late into the evening. As Patricia turned away from the backyard and stepped into the kitchen to help put away the leftover food, she tried not to think about another possible reason why her husband, the owner of his own successful business, might be looking for additional part-time production line work that paid under $6.50 an hour, so much less than he made at Lyle's Supply. The sound of clattering dishes suddenly brought Patricia's attention back to the present, and pulling on her apron, she gave herself a mental shake. What she really needed to do was stop all this worrying and trust in God's plan for her life. Besides, in another few weeks, she and Ted would be going on a marriage enrichment retreat, and Patricia was sure that once they had a chance to sit down and really talk to each other, they would both find new ways to connect with one another. And she could put all of her jitters and suspicions to rest. Still, Patricia felt a jolt when she finally heard the question that one of the women in the kitchen was repeating for the second time. It was one of Patricia's fellow Sunday school teachers, and she was asking Patricia if it was true that Ted was working at Precision Fabrics out in neighboring Greensboro. Summoning up one more smile, Patricia told her friend that yes, Ted would be starting there in 9 days, on Monday, September 18th. And then, bending over the dishwasher to hide her face, Patricia did her best to sound happy when she added, "And yeah, I think he's really looking forward to it." 1 month after the barbecue for members of the Elm Street Baptist Church, on Monday, October 9th, 1995, Patricia pulled into the parking lot at Cinnamon Ridge Apartments a few minutes before 8 a.m. Before heading into the office where she worked as the property manager, Patricia thought about the telephone call she had made 3 days earlier on Friday night. Patricia and Ted were both very close to Ted's former boss, Gary Lyle, who had basically passed Lyle's Supply Store on to Ted right after Ted and Patricia got married. But when Gary wasn't there, it was Gary's wife, Rose, that Patricia had talked to on the phone. Patricia had thought for a long time before making that phone call But considering all that had happened in the last several weeks, Patricia had known that she had to confide in someone, even if what Patricia had to say sounded completely unbelievable. Now, sitting in her car and looking out at the clear sky of what was sure to be a beautiful fall day in North Carolina, Patricia put her hands together at her chest, lowered her head, and said a short prayer, hoping that the prediction she had made to Rose 3 days earlier would never come true. By 3:30 p.m., Patricia was ready to leave the office for the day and head home to 2401 Brandon Station Court and cut the grass. Patricia was glad that the day had been quiet and trouble-free at Cinnamon Ridge. 3 months earlier, in July, Patricia had had to evict one of the tenants at the apartment complex. The confrontation had been ugly, and the tenant had made threats against Patricia's life. As Patricia stood up at her desk and pulled on her light jacket, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and a few minutes later she'd hopped into her car and was making the 13-mile drive south to Pleasant Garden. All in all, it had been a good day. Patricia had used her lunch break to run an errand in Greensboro and to make a surprise stop at Lyle's Supply with a bag of hamburgers and french fries that she'd picked up at a local fast food restaurant for Ted's lunch. The two of them had avoided talking about money or about the fact that Ted wouldn't be home that evening until after his shift at Precision Fabrics, which ended at 11 p.m. Instead, they talked about what Ted's younger brother, Ronnie Jr., had planned for his short leave home from the Marine base where he was stationed at Camp Lejeune, 3 hours to the southeast in Jacksonville, North Carolina. Like most people who knew the Kimball brothers, Patricia had always been struck by the obvious favoritism that their parents had always shown for Ted. That had always made her feel a little protective of her awkward but straight-arrow brother-in-law, and glad he had met and married his fresh-faced and cheerful wife, Kimberly. Patricia had also reminded Ted that after she mowed the grass that afternoon, she'd be going to a Bible study group that was meeting at 7 p.m. at the church. But at about 4 o'clock, as soon as Patricia caught sight of her house on Brandon Station Court, she knew right away that she'd be changing her afternoon plans. And when she pulled into the driveway of the one-story green home with the American flag next to the door, she smiled, pulling her car over to the far left so she could squeeze in next to the vehicle already parked in her driveway. It didn't matter that Patricia was now parked halfway on top of the grass she intended to cut, because as she turned off the engine and hopped out of the car and headed to the front door, she knew she was not going to be mowing the lawn, at least not yet, because Patricia Kimball had company. A little over 4.5 hours later, the first Pleasant Garden fire engine, lights flashing and volunteer firefighters in full protective gear clinging to the outside grips, came screeching around the bend of Brandon Station Court. All eyes were already on number 2401, the one-story green house that now had waves of thick, muddy-looking smoke pouring out from under the front door and the openings in the chimneys, windows, and vents. And none of these first responders needed to be told that this house belonged to Patricia and Ted Kimball. Because the dispatcher at the fire department, who had taken the 911 call at 8:46 p.m. that evening reporting a house fire at 2401, had been Patricia's godfather. The emergency call was also personal for the lead firefighter, who had hopped down from the jump seat on the fire engine even before the truck had come to a full stop. 24-year-old Alan Fields had gone to high school with Ted Kimball, and he knew Patricia's family, the Blakeleys, even better. According to dispatch, Patricia's brother, Reuben, had gotten a call at about 8 p.m. from Ted at Precision Fabrics, asking Reuben to go check on Patricia, who had not been answering Ted's telephone calls. Now, even before his crew had connected the hose to the nearest fire hydrant, Alan could feel the intense heat coming off the house in waves as he and his fellow firefighters rushed through the carport to the side door of the house that led into the kitchen. But nothing in Alan's 6 years with the fire department had prepared him for the blast of superheated air and smoke that smothered him and his crew as soon as they had pushed through that door. And less than a minute later, unable to see and unable to breathe, Alan frantically motioned his crew backward. As they stumbled back out of the house and pulled off their masks to drink in huge gulps of fresh air, somewhere above and around them, the firefighters could hear the crackle and snap of nearby leaves and tree branches sucking in the heat from the house below. And out in the street, under the flashing lights of the fire engines and the sheriff department cars, firefighters could make out the growing crowd of neighbors and family and friends of the Kimballs and the Blakeleys. Even as Alan called for high-powered fans to clear the smoke from the interior of the house, every firefighter there was already thinking about the sight of Patricia Kimball's car parked over the edge of the driveway, wondering if she was inside, still alive, waiting for them. Just then, Alan heard a shout from the front corner of the house. Using a long metal rod, one of the firefighters had smashed through one of the bedroom windows, hoping they might be able to pull out Patricia or anyone else in the house who might be crouching just on the other side of the wall. But even as the firefighter reached his arm through the window, there was a sudden burst of flames as the oxygen pouring in from outside reignited the hot embers inside. As another team passed a hose through the broken window to douse the fire that had just erupted, Alan and his crew pushed back into the kitchen, following the stream of air from the fans that was slowly knocking aside the walls of smoke. As the pressurized stream from the hose began hitting the walls and floor and ceiling, the air in the kitchen, then the living room, and then the hallway was filled with the sound of sizzling water. Working in the lead, Alan could just barely make out in the darkness the long strips of paint that had blistered and peeled off the walls, and the burned and smoking insulation and crumbling sheetrock scattered around their heavy boots, when suddenly, the floor just seemed to disappear right from under Alan's feet. One second he was standing, and the next, he felt himself falling and rolling into a small space under the hallway, a 4-foot deep hole that had burned through the floorboards. But before Alan could even process what had just happened, he was suddenly aware of something firm but yielding underneath him. As Alan put out one gloved hand to steady himself, he suddenly knew with terrible certainty that they had just found 28-year-old Patricia Kimball. By the time Detective Jim Church from the Guilford County Sheriff's Department met up with his supervisor at 2401 Brandon Station Court that night, sheriff deputies had already strung yellow tape around the Kimball's property to hold back the crowd of spectators, and crime lab technicians and Guilford County fire inspectors were already combing through the smoking rubble inside the house. But within minutes, a simple walkthrough of the damaged building, lit by portable floodlights, told Detective Church and Sergeant Detective David DeBerry a lot of what those techs and inspectors would later confirm. The most important and obvious piece of that information was that the fire that had killed Patricia Kimball had not been an accident. Sitting right in the middle of the kitchen was an empty gasoline can, and Detective Church, who was also a volunteer firefighter, pointed out the obvious burn pattern caused by an accelerant like gasoline that led from the kitchen over the back of a couch in the living room and then down the hallway to where Patricia's body had been discovered. The detectives and fire inspector would also agree that whoever had set the fire had probably hoped it would burn long and hot enough to destroy the entire house. Instead, the fire had probably only burned intensely for maybe a few minutes, not hours, leaving the bedrooms in the house practically untouched by actual flames. And those bedrooms, especially the Kimball's master bedroom, told their own part of the story. As investigators stood in the doorway and took in the sight of the emptied-out dresser drawers, overturned nightstand, and the mattress pulled off the bed, they both came to the same conclusion. Before setting the fire, the arsonist had tried to make it look like the house had been robbed. Except the arsonist had not done a very convincing job, leaving behind items like an expensive camera that were of obvious value. There had also been no sign of forced entry into the house. The pry marks that deputies had discovered on the side door into the house were marks that had been left from the robbery that had taken place earlier in that same year. While investigators would go on to spend hours tracking down the robbery gone wrong angle, their initial take on this crime was that the robbery had been staged to cover up the death of Patricia Kimball, and not that Patricia had been killed when she walked into her house and surprised a burglar. There was also the fact that Patricia's car was parked half on the driveway and half on the grass that suggested to detectives that when Patricia had arrived home, there had to have been another vehicle already parked in the driveway. Otherwise, Patricia, who intended to cut the grass, would not have parked on top of the grass. And whoever had been driving that vehicle had to have been someone Patricia knew or recognized. After experiencing 2 traumatic break-ins, police believed there was just no way that Patricia would ever have unlocked her door and entered the house with someone she didn't know. But even before detectives stepped into the room inside of Patricia's house, where her body was now laying on a white sheet, detectives knew that they were not going to have much in the way of physical and forensic evidence to help them in this investigation. Between the fire, smoke damage, and the water from the fire hoses that now sloshed around their feet, they knew that the crime scene techs were just not going to find anything in the way of fingerprints or DNA. Still, the first horrible sight of Patricia's body was enough to make every law enforcement officer in that house 100% committed to finding whoever had set this fire. Surrounded by the ruins of her own wedding pictures and cross-stitched framed Bible verses, nothing recognizable remained of the beautiful, vibrant young woman with the chocolate brown eyes and infectious smile. Patricia lay face down with her arms, bent at the elbow, raised above her head. All but one tuft of clothing had been burned from her body, and only charred stumps remained where her left foot and entire right leg should have been. Around her, patches and smears of bright red blood were the only signs that this had once been a living, breathing human being. And then, scanning the length of the ravaged body, both detectives saw it at the same time. Directly behind Patricia's left ear, there was a small, dark bullet hole. And suddenly, everything about this case changed. Patricia had to have been shot from behind in the head, and by the time the arsonist had staged the robbery and then set the fire, Patricia was already dead. Within 4 days of Patricia's murder, police had already ruled out the most obvious suspects. At the top of that list was Patricia's husband, Ted, not because of any obvious evidence, but because most violent homicides are committed by people close to the victim. But not only was Ted in a state of shock that there was anyone in Pleasant Garden who would want to hurt Patricia, he also had a cast iron alibi for the time of the murder, which the medical examiner had determined must have occurred just after 4 p.m. on the afternoon of October 9th, not long after Patricia had arrived home from work, intending to mow the grass. Answering every question put to him by police, Ted explained that from the time he left his house on that Monday morning at 7:45 a.m. until the time he called Patricia's brother Ruben at 8 p.m. to ask Ruben to go check on Patricia, Ted was either at work at Lyle's Supply or at Precision Fabrics. And in between those 2 jobs, he had met up with his mother, Edna Kimball, for dinner at Mrs. Winter's Chicken and Biscuits, a local restaurant not far from Precision Fabrics. Ted's account of Patricia stopping by in the afternoon to meet him for lunch, along with a call he made to her office at Cinnamon Ridge later in the afternoon, just before she left work, also lined up with what police had learned about Patricia's last day from her coworkers. Police also quickly ruled out 2 other suspects. The man who had broken into the Kimball house early in 1995 could not have murdered Patricia because he was still in jail at the time. Still, Detective Church conducted an interview with the suspect and went over the facts of the earlier break-in. Investigators also tracked down the tenant that Patricia had recently evicted from Cinnamon Ridge Apartments, but she too had an alibi for the time of the murder. But even as detectives seemed to be hitting one dead end after another, they were also turning up more and more information about growing strains between Patricia and Ted in the weeks leading up to Patricia's murder. Patricia had confided to friends that she and Ted argued about Ted spending too much money. Ted had also tried to take out $100,000 of life insurance on his wife, and Patricia had absolutely refused to sign off on the policy. Those same friends also told police that when Ted started working his part-time job at Precision Fabrics about 1 month before Patricia's death, Patricia had worried that he hadn't taken the job because he wanted more money. Instead, he had taken the job because he wanted to spend less time with Patricia. And despite the fact that Ted had an alibi and that he never collected on that life insurance policy, police continued to treat Ted as a suspect, circling back again and again to ask him more questions about his relationship with his wife and looking for inconsistencies in the story Ted had told police about his activities on the day of Patricia's murder. It wasn't until Ted hired a lawyer and later posted a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Patricia's murderer that investigators were forced to leave Ted Kimball alone and admit that the homicide investigation into Patricia's death had started going cold. But for Detective Jim Church, this was a case he just could not let go of. And over the next 14 months, the 49-year-old investigator kept track of any new developments in the lives of Patricia Kimball's family and friends. He also reached out beyond Patricia's immediate circle to interview Ted's brother Ronnie out at Camp Lejeune and any of the women that Ted had dated before he married Patricia, including Patricia's cousin, Janet Blakely. But it wouldn't be until late January 1997, more than 1 year after Patricia Kimball's murder, that Detective Church finally got the tip that would break his first homicide investigation wide open. And when that tip came in, Detective Church literally could not believe the identity of the caller, the tipster, at the other end of the telephone line. It was the son of Reverend Jerry Falwell, the founder of Liberty University in Virginia and one of America's best-known Baptist pastors, televangelists, and conservative activists. And according to Jerry Falwell's son and attorney, one of the students enrolled at Liberty University's training program for pastors had just given the Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr. the name of someone who might be involved in the death of Patricia Kimball. And a little over 2 months later, Detective Church and Detective DeBerry, along with investigators from the North Carolina Special Bureau of Investigation, were ready to make their first arrests on charges of first-degree murder. Based on the investigation into the tip from Reverend Falwell, here is a reconstruction of what police believe really happened to Patricia Kimball 16 months earlier, on the afternoon of October 9th, 1995. Patricia's killer was patient. Waiting at the Kimball's house, the killer was grateful that 2401 was the only house that had been built yet on Brandon Station Court. It was still possible, but really not very likely, that a neighbor might notice the vehicle in the driveway. Besides, it was not really in the killer's nature to worry about those types of details. Instead, the killer had let themselves inside the house and prepared for the moment when Patricia came home. The killer was methodical. Once they had taken up their position inside the bathroom, just off the hallway that led from the living room down to the 3 bedrooms, the killer racked the slide of the Glock 45 pistol one more time, checked that the bathroom door was not closed all the way, then carefully made another mental review of the plan. It wasn't that the killer disliked Patricia. It wasn't even that the killer stood to benefit from Patricia's death. There were just some responsibilities in life that could not be argued or bargained away. And killing Patricia was one of those obligations. And this would be a fast and merciful death. The killer thought about that and decided that Patricia probably would not even feel any pain, just surprise. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Patricia had stopped her car at an intersection and waved a quick hello to another driver. As Patricia let up on the brake and moved forward again, she thought how completely ordinary her life must seem from the outside. And after spending her lunch with Ted at Lyle's Supply earlier that day, and picking up the phone this afternoon and hearing his familiar voice, Patricia wondered if maybe there was hope for their marriage after all. She had seen how bitter and destructive divorce had been for her own parents, and if she could avoid going down that road herself, she would. And with that thought in mind, Patricia took a deep breath and forced herself to concentrate on the here and now. It was a beautiful, warm afternoon, and it would feel good to get outside and cut the grass, and maybe do some other yard work before getting changed and cleaned up for her evening Bible study group. But when Patricia rounded the curve of Brandon Station Court and saw the vehicle that was sitting in her driveway, her spirits suddenly lifted. This was unexpected, but unlike a lot of the things that had been happening lately in Patricia's life, a visit with this person was unexpected in a good way. Smiling, Patricia pulled her car into the driveway and parked half on the asphalt and half on the grass. A moment later, and Patricia was walking through the open doors of the two-car garage. Calling out a cheerful hello, she reached the side entrance into the kitchen, pushed it open, and stepped inside. Patricia was a little surprised when she heard a slightly muffled answer coming from deeper inside the house, but she didn't hesitate before following the voice down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. And this was exactly the moment the killer had been waiting for. As soon as Patricia passed the closed bathroom on her left, she never even noticed when the door opened behind her. Silent as a ghost, the killer stepped forward, pressed the barrel of the gun against the back of Patricia's skull just behind her left ear, and pulled the trigger. Inside the small house, the blast from the gun was deafening. But even as Patricia's body fell forward onto the hallway floor, arms raised over her head, the killer was already on the move. Picking up the can of gas they had hidden in the bathroom, the killer started in the kitchen and poured a stream of gasoline that led through the living room, over the living room sofa, and down the hallway to Patricia's dead body. Standing over Patricia, the killer poured until Patricia's body was soaked and dripping. Satisfied, the killer headed for the master bedroom. Once there, the killer pulled out the dresser drawers, tossed out the clothes, knocked over the nightstand, and pulled the mattress off the bed. Pausing long enough to catch their breath, the killer went back down the hallway, picked up the empty can of gasoline, and then walked quickly into the kitchen, putting the can down on the floor where police would find it almost 5 hours later. Taking a few steps backward, the killer took the packet of matches out of their pocket. There was a scraping sound as the head of the match dragged along the strike plate, and then a hiss as the match caught fire. Flicking the lighted match towards the puddle of gasoline, the killer only stayed long enough to make sure the flames caught as the fire began its journey from the kitchen, through the living room, over the sofa, and finally, going up in a roar as it reached the body laid out in the 12-foot-long hallway. A minute later, and the killer was gone. Late in January of 1997, 16 months after Patricia's murder, Ronnie Jr. and his wife Kimberly were out in Lynchburg, Virginia, visiting one of Ronnie's old friends. Mitch Whidden was a former Marine who was now enrolled in the Pastoral Leadership Program at Liberty University, the same program and the same university where Ronnie Jr.'s own father had studied back when Ronnie was just a boy. It was also the same program and university where Ronnie had decided that he would like to go once his military service was over. Mitch knew that Ronnie had been very affected by the tragic and unsolved murder of his sister-in-law, Patricia, and Mitch hoped that his friend's decision to go into the ministry would help Ronnie find comfort and direction in his life. But when the two friends sat down together in the evening to pray, Mitch was totally shocked at the change that suddenly came over Ronnie when Mitch began to read out loud from the Bible. Jumping to his feet, Ronnie paced back and forth across the room before slamming his hands against his head, and then he turned to face Mitch and he said, "I did it. I killed her. I killed Patricia." One day later, on Saturday, January 25th, Mitch drove to Liberty University and put in a desperate request to speak to the university founder, Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr. Mitch needed Reverend Falwell's advice. Mitch had heard a murder confession from a friend, but the friend had refused to turn himself into the police. Within minutes, the Reverend's son, an attorney, was calling Detective Church at the Guilford County Sheriff's Department, advising the detective to go speak with a seminary student at Liberty University named Mitch Whidden. Detective Church did not waste any time. 9 days later, Mitch Whidden was talking directly to Detectives Church and DeBerry, along with an agent from the North Carolina Special Bureau of Investigation. And according to Mitch Whidden, Ronnie Kimball had not acted alone. On the night that Ronnie confessed to Mitch that Ronnie had killed Patricia, Ronnie had also said that it was his older brother, Ted, Patricia's husband, who had asked him to commit the murder. Although Ted had promised his younger brother a cut of the life insurance money Ted expected to collect after Patricia was dead, Ronnie had told Mitch that he agreed to kill Patricia because Ronnie would rather die than say no to his older brother. It would turn out that in the months leading up to her death, Patricia Kimball had every reason to be worried, not only about her marriage, but also about her personal safety. Patricia had been upset when Ted pressured her to sign off on a life insurance policy that would have paid Ted $100,000 in the event of Patricia's death and $200,000 in the event that Patricia died an accidental death, like, for example, if she was burned to death in a tragic house fire. What Patricia did not know until just days before her death was that after Patricia had refused to sign off on that insurance policy, Ted had forged her name on the policy and submitted it to the insurance company. What Ted apparently did not know when he forged Patricia's signature and when he asked his brother Ronnie to kill Patricia was that the insurance company needed more than just Patricia's signature to issue the policy. They also needed Patricia to take a series of blood tests as well as a physical examination in order to approve the paperwork. And when the insurance company agent and the doctor's office called to schedule those tests, saying they had Patricia's signature on the policy, Patricia had become hysterical, said no to the tests, and slammed down the phone. It was on Friday, October 6th, 1995, 3 days before her murder, and right after Patricia had found out about the forgery, that she called Gary and Rose Lyle and told Rose that if anything ever happened to her, Patricia, police should investigate her husband, Ted. What Patricia had never suspected was that Ted, who had always seemed to wield a lot of power and influence over his younger brother Ronnie, would somehow persuade or pressure Ronnie to actually harm or kill Patricia. And apparently, Patricia was murdered before the insurance company had time to contact Ted and tell him that the company could not issue the insurance policy he had requested for his wife Patricia, and upon her death, Ted would not be collecting on the forged policy. Right from the start of the investigation, Detectives Church and DeBerry suspected that Ted had to be involved, and they had even begun to suspect that Ronnie Jr. may have conspired with Ted to kill Patricia. But without a confession, and without any hard physical evidence that linked either brother to the crime, the investigation had ground to a halt. However, in the months before Ronnie's confession to his friend Mitch Whidden, Detective Church continued to collect information that suggested to police that Ted's motive for getting married in the first place was money. Gary Lyle, Ted's employer at Lyle's Building Supply, had made it clear that he was more likely to sell his business to Ted if Ted were married and settled down. And Patricia's cousin, Janet Blakely, was one of at least 2 women who had all turned down Ted's marriage proposals. Janet's tears when she learned about Patricia's engagement to Ted had less to do with envy and more to do with concern for Patricia, who was wearing the engagement ring that Ted had offered to Janet just 1 month earlier. Police even speculated that Ted's decision to get part-time work at Precision Fabrics was just to make sure that he would have an alibi when he arranged for Patricia's murder. It would also turn out that Ted had a history of running insurance scams. He overreported the number of items that had been stolen from the Kimball house in those 2 earlier robberies, and he also inflated the claims related to the fire damage on the house. Ted would also be charged with stealing construction supplies from local businesses and from a local church that he would later sell at Lyle's Supply. On March 31st, 1997, more than 17 months after the brutal murder of Patricia Kimball, police arrested Ted and Ronnie Kimball on charges of first-degree murder, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. In September of 1998, almost 3 years after killing his sister-in-law, Ronnie Jr. was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 3 months later, and 1 month before Ted was scheduled to go on trial, a search of Ted's prison cell revealed detailed escape plans along with Ted's plans to hire someone to kill 5 witnesses who were scheduled to testify against him. Included on that hit list were Gary Lyle, the man who gave Ted his start in business, and Gary's wife Rose, Patricia's telephone confidant. 2 months after police discovered Ted's hit list, Ted Kimball avoided a jury trial by pleading guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder along with arson and conspiracy. In January of 1999, a little over 3 years after Patricia's murder, Ted Kimball was sentenced to 107 years in prison.